The day had started like any other, until my mother called to announce a dinner. She wanted us to meet someone. Mark's back, she said casually, as if the name shouldn't sting. It had been years since I'd seen my stepfather, and the thought of his return stirred something in me. By the time evening fell, the house was alive with the hum of conversation. I watched my mother bustle around the kitchen, her movements quick and efficient, while Cavin remained glued to his phone. When the door finally opened and Mark walked in, the room seemed to shift. He looked older, but not diminished. His presence filled the space effortlessly, and his easy smile was disarming. Ellie, he said, using the nickname I hadn't heard in years. His voice was warm, almost too familiar, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Mark, I managed, my voice softer than I intended. His gaze lingered just a second longer than polite, and I felt my pulse quicken. Throughout dinner, I found myself stealing glances at him. He was charming and attentive, engaging my mother in conversation and making everyone laugh with his stories. Yet, it was the small moments that caught me off guard. The way he listened intently when I spoke, his eyes never leaving mine. Cavin was seated beside me, but it was Mark's presence that seemed to fill the space between us. At one point, Mark reached across the table to pour me a glass of wine. Our hands brushed briefly, and the contact sent an inexplicable shiver down my spine. It was nothing, I told myself, just a harmless gesture. But the way he looked at me then, steady, unyielding, made it hard to breathe. Later, as I cleared the table, he joined me in the kitchen. "You've done well for yourself, Ellie," he said, his tone low, almost conspiratorial. "Have I?" I replied, avoiding his gaze as I loaded dishes into the sink. "You seem different," he continued, leaning casually against the counter. "More restrained, perhaps?" I didn't know how to respond, so I laughed it off. "People change, Mark. That's life." He nodded, but his eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. "Maybe, but some things don't," he said quietly, before returning to the others. I stood there for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. His words echoed in my mind, unsettling and yet strangely comforting. As the evening wound down, I felt the weight of his gaze on me more than once. Each time, I told myself it was nothing. But as he hugged me goodbye, his hand lingered a fraction too long on my back, and I knew this wasn't over. The party was in full swing, and the house hummed with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Cavin, ever the host, was engrossed in entertaining his colleagues near the patio. I busied myself inside, refilling platters and dodging the occasional polite small talk. It was easier to stay busy than to focus on the unease that had settled in my chest since Mark arrived. When my mother asked me to grab extra serving plates from the small garden shed, I welcomed the excuse to step away. The air outside was cool, a sharp contrast to the warmth and chatter inside. I pushed open the shed door, my hands already reaching for the plates on the top shelf. The soft creak of the door behind me made me turn, startled. "Need help?" Mark's voice was calm, unhurried. He stood in the doorway, his frame outlined by the faint glow from the house. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, though the plates wobbled precariously in my hands. He stepped forward anyway, his presence filling the confined space of the shed. "Here, let me." His fingers brushed mine as he took the plates from me, and the touch was fleeting but electric. My heart thudded in my chest, and I prayed he couldn't hear it. The shed was small, and I became hyper-aware of how close we were. Mark set the plates on the nearby table and leaned casually against the wall. "So," he began, his tone light but probing, "how's life treating you, Ellie?" "It's fine," I said, perhaps too quickly. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and he smiled, a knowing, almost disarming smile. "Fine?" he repeated, his voice laced with mild skepticism. You don't strike me as someone who settles for fine. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Life is busy, I said finally, a safe response that didn't give away too much. Busy isn't always fulfilling, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on mine. What about you? What do you want, Ellie? His question caught me off guard. It wasn't the kind of thing Cavin, or anyone else for that matter, would ask. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't find the words. I'm not sure, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a nearby glass, his hand brushing against mine as he passed it to me. The gesture was simple, mundane even, but it sent a wave of heat through me. My fingers trembled slightly as I took the glass, and I prayed he didn't notice. You've changed, he said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. You're holding something back. The words hit a nerve I didn't know was exposed. My pulse quickened, and I felt the weight of his gaze, steady and unrelenting. Maybe, I said, barely meeting his eyes. But isn't that what people do? Change? Not always, he replied, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Some things stay the same, no matter how much time passes. The air in the shed seemed to thicken, the distance between us shrinking with every word. I could feel the heat of him, the scent of his cologne mingling with the faint smell of wood and earth. His gaze dropped briefly to my lips, before returning to my eyes, and my breath hitched. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Then, almost imperceptibly, he leaned in. My heart pounded as I felt his breath against my skin. Ellie, he murmured, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. Desire, hesitation, or maybe both. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, our lips met. The kiss was sudden, unplanned, and yet it felt inevitable. His hand brushed lightly against my arm, and the sensation sent shivers coursing through me. The sound of laughter from outside shattered the moment, jolting us back to reality. I pulled away abruptly, my breath shallow and unsteady. Mark stepped back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made my knees weak. I began, my voice faltering. Go, he finished for me, his voice steady but quiet. I grabbed the plates and left the shed, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Back in the house, the party continued, as if nothing had happened. But for me, everything had shifted. The days following the party were a blur, but not the kind that fades into insignificance. Instead, every moment felt heavy, saturated with a mix of guilt and longing that I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on my usual routines, organizing the house, helping Cavin with his plans, but my thoughts always drifted back to the shed, to Mark, to the way his lips had felt against mine, the way his voice had sent a shiver through me. Each memory was vivid, like a reel on repeat in my mind. I told myself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, but the weight of my guilt didn't stop the thoughts from flooding in. At night, lying next to Cavin, I would glance at him and feel a wave of shame. He had done nothing wrong. If anything, he was the perfect husband, caring, hardworking, dependable. And yet, that was part of the problem. Dependable didn't ignite a fire. Dependable didn't make my heart race. Mark, on the other hand, was everything Cavin wasn't. He was unpredictable, intense, and he had this way of looking at me, like he saw all the parts of me I'd hidden away. It was intoxicating. It was wrong. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more I found myself yearning for it. It didn't help that Mark seemed to be everywhere. He started showing up more often, each visit seemingly casual, but I couldn't ignore the way his presence changed the air in the room. One afternoon, he arrived unannounced while Cavin was at work. My mother had asked him to help with some gardening, and he'd agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that his real reason for coming had little to do with pruning roses. Need a hand? He asked, his voice startling me as I knelt by the flower bed. I looked up, the sun casting a halo around his figure. "I think I've got it," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. He crouched down beside me anyway, his knee brushing against mine. "Still, two pairs of hands are better than one," he said, his tone light but layered with something unspoken. The tension between us was palpable, though neither of us acknowledged it directly. As we worked side by side, our arms occasionally brushing, I felt my resolve weakening. I kept telling myself it was harmless, just a little gardening, just small talk. But every glance, every accidental touch, felt like a thread pulling me closer to him, unraveling my carefully constructed walls. When Cavin returned home that evening, Mark stayed for dinner. It wasn't unusual. He'd become a regular guest lately, especially when Cavin was too busy to notice the subtle shifts in the room. Over dinner, Mark made a point to engage everyone, his charm effortless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his attention was always slightly skewed toward me. "Ellie, you've been quiet tonight," he remarked, his eyes locking onto mine across the table. I forced a smile, ignoring the way Cavin glanced at me curiously. "Just tired," I replied, though the truth was far more complicated. The days turned into weeks, and my attempts to keep my distance from Mark only seemed to draw him closer. He found reasons to linger, whether it was fixing a broken light fixture or offering to help with household tasks that didn't need fixing at all. Every encounter was laced with an unspoken tension, and I found myself anticipating them, even as I tried to convince myself I shouldn't. It wasn't just his presence that affected me, it was the way I changed around him. I began paying more attention to my appearance, choosing outfits that made me feel confident but not obvious. At first, I told myself it was for Cavin, but deep down, I knew the truth. It was Mark's eyes I wanted to catch, his approval I sought, even if I didn't want to admit it. One evening, as I got ready for dinner, I caught myself in the mirror. The dress I'd chosen was simple but elegant, the kind that clung in just the right places. I adjusted the neckline, smoothing the fabric over my hips, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of shame. But it was fleeting, replaced almost instantly by a rush of anticipation. Dinner that night was uneventful on the surface. Cavin talked about work, my mother chimed in with updates on her book club, and Mark, as always, managed to be the perfect conversationalist. But beneath the surface, the tension between us crackled like a live wire. When Mark offered to help me clear the table, I hesitated for a moment before nodding. In the kitchen, the silence between us was deafening. As I handed him a stack of plates, our fingers brushed, and I felt that familiar spark. "You're quiet tonight," he said, echoing his words from before. I didn't trust myself to answer, so I turned back to the sink, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for a dish. "Ellie," he said softly, his voice so close that it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to face him, my heart pounding, but before either of us could say anything more, the sound of footsteps approaching broke the moment. Cavin entered the kitchen, oblivious to the charged atmosphere. "You two okay in here?" he asked, smiling as he took the plates from Mark. "Of course," Mark replied smoothly, his expression unreadable. But as I returned to the dining room, my heart still racing, I knew the truth. I was anything but okay. The garage smelled of sawdust and old paint, a quiet, familiar space that had always been more Cavin's domain than mine. But today, it was different. Mark stood near the workbench, sleeves rolled up, inspecting a piece of battered wood from the broken chair my mother had insisted I restore. His presence filled the space in a way that made the air feel heavier, more charged. "You know," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a crooked smile, "this chair might be past saving." I crossed my arms and stepped closer, determined not to let him get the upper hand. "Well, you're the expert, aren't you? I'm sure you can figure it out," I teased, keeping my tone light, though my heart was already starting to race. He chuckled, the sound low and warm, and turned back to the chair. I don't know if stubbornness will fix this thing, Ellie, he said, raising an eyebrow. Stubbornness has gotten me pretty far, I shot back, unable to resist the playful jab. Mark paused, looking at me longer than necessary, his gaze steady and unwavering. That it has, he said softly, the teasing edge in his voice replaced by something deeper. The space between us seemed to shrink, the sounds of the world outside fading into a dull hum. He handed me a screwdriver, our fingers brushing in the process, and I felt a jolt of energy shoot through me. I turned away quickly, focusing on the task at hand, but I could feel his eyes on me, like a weight I couldn't ignore. As we worked side by side, the tension in the room grew heavier, the silence punctuated only by the occasional scrape of metal against wood. I tried to focus, to push away the thoughts swirling in my head, but his presence was overwhelming. When I glanced up, I caught him watching me, his gaze lingering in a way that made my breath catch. Do you always stare this much when you're working? I asked, trying to inject some levity into the moment. He smirked, leaning casually against the workbench. Only when the company's worth staring at. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't fight the smile tugging at my lips. You're impossible, I said, shaking my head. Maybe, he replied, his voice softer now, but you don't seem to mind. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I set the screwdriver down, suddenly unable to concentrate. This is ridiculous, I muttered, more to myself than to him. Is it? He asked, stepping closer. His tone was calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made it impossible to look away. Because it doesn't feel ridiculous to me. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. My heart pounded as he moved closer, the heat of his body an almost tangible force. Ellie, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me you don't feel it too. I hesitated, my mind a whirlwind of guilt and longing. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but the truth was undeniable. I can't, I admitted, my voice trembling. His eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of us. Then stop running from it, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Before I could think, before I could rationalize, he closed the remaining distance between us. His hand brushed against my cheek, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was different this time, slower, deeper, as if we were both savoring the inevitability of it. I felt myself lean into him, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt, as if it were the only thing anchoring me to the moment. The weight of the world, the guilt, the fear, all of it faded away, replaced by a desperate, undeniable need. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart racing. Mark didn't move, his forehead resting lightly against mine. This changes everything, he said quietly, his voice laced with both conviction and regret. I know, I whispered, unable to look at him. We stood there for a moment, the gravity of what had just happened settling over us. For the first time, the full weight of our actions hit me. There was no turning back now, no pretending this hadn't happened. Mark stepped back, his hand trailing down my arm before he let go entirely. We should get back, he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the turmoil beneath. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. As I followed him out of the garage, the world seemed sharper, more vivid. Every sound, every movement felt amplified, like I was seeing everything through a new lens. But as we rejoined the others, slipping back into the roles we were supposed to play, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath me had shifted, and I had no idea where it would lead. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of my actions grew heavier with each passing moment. I had become a master of pretense, smiling when I needed to, laughing at the right moments, playing the role of the devoted wife. But deep down, I was crumbling. Cavin began to notice the cracks. He wasn't one to pry, but his sharp intuition couldn't ignore the growing distance between us. One evening at dinner, as I pushed food around on my plate, He set his fork down and looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Ellie, he began, his voice measured. Is everything okay? I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. Of course, I replied, forcing a smile. Why wouldn't it be? You've been different lately, he said, his brows furrowing. Distracted? Quiet? Is there something you're not telling me? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, my heart pounding in my chest. It's just work, I lied, clutching at the first excuse that came to mind. And I've been tired, that's all. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. If something's bothering you, you can tell me, he said softly. I know, I replied quickly, averting my gaze. Really, I'm fine. But I wasn't fine, and the growing suspicion in Cavin's eyes told me he didn't believe me. The stolen moments with Mark had become both my escape and my torment. Each encounter was charged with a mix of longing and guilt, the boundaries between us growing blurrier with every glance, every touch. One afternoon, when Cavin was at work and my mother had gone out to run errands, Mark showed up unannounced. He claimed he needed to check on something in the house, but the look in his eyes told me it was just an excuse to see me. We ended up in the living room, our conversation shifting from casual to loaded with unspoken tension. He stood close, too close, his presence enveloping me like a storm I couldn't outrun. Ellie, he said, his voice low, how long are we going to keep pretending this doesn't mean anything? I looked away, my hands trembling. It's not that simple, Mark, I whispered. It never is, he replied, stepping closer. His hand brushed against mine, and I felt the familiar rush of heat that both thrilled and terrified me. Before I could respond, the sound of a car door slamming outside sent a jolt of panic through me. She's back, I hissed, my voice barely audible. Go, he urged, his tone urgent but calm. I darted toward the back door, my heart racing as I slipped out and made my way around the side of the house. From the shadows, I watched as my mother entered, calling out for Mark. He greeted her casually, his demeanor unshaken, but my pulse didn't slow until I was safely back in my own house. The tension reached a boiling point a few days later. Cavin had been more distant, his usual warmth replaced by a quiet, brooding energy. I tried to brush it off as work stress, but deep down, I knew better. That evening, as I sat in the living room with a book I wasn't actually reading, I heard the unmistakable sound of his car pulling into the driveway. My heart sank. He wasn't supposed to be home for another 2 hours. The door opened, and he stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral. Hey, he said, setting his bag down. Hi, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. You're home early. Yeah, he said, his tone casual, but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I figured I'd surprise you. There was a pause, heavy and uncomfortable. I forced a smile, my mind racing. That's nice, I said, closing the book. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me longer than necessary. You've been spending a lot of time at your mom's house lately, he said, his tone light but probing. I felt the blood drain from my face. She's been needing help with a few things, I said quickly, hoping my voice didn't betray me. Is that all? He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to meet his gaze. What else would it be? I replied, trying to keep my tone even. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching out like a taut wire. Finally, he sighed and shook his head. Nothing, he said, turning toward the kitchen. But as he walked away, I could feel the suspicion hanging in the air, unspoken but palpable. I knew this wasn't over. The garage was warm, the faint scent of sawdust and oil hanging in the air. The battered wooden chair sat in the center of the room, looking as though it had weathered a century of neglect. Mark was crouched beside it, his sleeves rolled up, holding a chisel in one hand and a hammer in the other. "This thing's a lost cause," he muttered, squinting at a stubborn groove in the wood. I leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, watching him with a mix of amusement and unease. "Are you admitting defeat?" I teased, a playful edge to my voice. He glanced up at me, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Never. I'm just considering the possibility that this chair has a grudge against me." I couldn't help but laugh, the sound breaking through the tension that had become second nature between us. "Maybe it's just smarter than it looks," I replied, stepping closer. Mark straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "And here, I thought you'd be on my side." "I'm always on the side of results," I shot back, a grin playing on my lips. He chuckled, the sound warm and familiar, and for a moment, the heaviness between us seemed to lift. But it was fleeting. As he turned back to the chair, the tension settled again, unspoken but undeniable. We worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of tools against wood and the occasional soft creak of the garage door shifting in the breeze. But the silence wasn't empty. It was charged, every glance and movement layered with things neither of us dared to say. "You know," Mark began after a while, his voice quiet, "I never wanted to make things harder for you." I looked up, startled by the sudden shift in tone. "You didn't," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. He set the chisel down and turned to face me, his expression serious. "I don't know about that, Ellie. I feel like I've done nothing but complicate your life since I showed up." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat, because he wasn't wrong. My life had become a tangle of emotions and choices I couldn't untangle, and at the center of it all was him. "It's not that simple," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "It never is," he replied, stepping closer. "But that doesn't change how I feel." The air between us felt thick, almost suffocating, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, a mirror of my own. "Mark," I began, my voice trembling, "this, whatever this is, it's impossible." "Maybe," he said softly, his gaze unwavering, "but it's real." I looked away, my chest tightening. The truth hung heavy between us, undeniable and inescapable. Just then, the chisel in Mark's hand slipped, lodging itself awkwardly in the groove he'd been working on. He cursed under his breath, his frustration breaking the moment. "Stuck again?" I asked, trying to inject some levity into my tone. "Seems that way," he muttered, tugging at the tool. I stepped closer, kneeling beside him. "Here, let me," I said, reaching for the chisel. Our hands brushed as we worked together, the contact sending a jolt through me that I tried to ignore. I laughed nervously, the sound too loud in the quiet space. "You're not very good at this, are you?" "Careful, Ellie," he said, his voice low, almost playful. "You might hurt my ego." I smiled, but it was forced. The proximity, the tension, it was too much. My hand slipped, and the chisel came free with a sharp scrape, nearly sending me off balance. Mark caught my arm, steadying me, and for a moment, we froze. His grip was firm but gentle, his eyes locked on mine. The air seemed to still, the world narrowing to just the two of us. But before either of us could speak, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. "Cavin!" I whispered, my heart leaping into my throat. Mark let go of my arm and stepped back, his expression shifting to one of practiced calm. "Go," he said quietly, turning back to the chair as though nothing had happened. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, before moving to the workbench and pretending to sort through tools. The door to the garage creaked open, and Cavin stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "What's going on in here?" he asked, a smile on his face. "Just trying to salvage this chair," Mark replied smoothly, his tone casual. Cavin nodded, his eyes shifting to me. "You okay?" "Fine. I said quickly, forcing a smile. Mark's been helping me. Cavin's gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary, but he didn't press. Dinner's ready, he said finally. As he turned to leave, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Mark met my gaze, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't place regret, longing, or maybe both.